Good morning, I'm Taylor Wilson, and today is Tuesday, November 19th, 2024. This is The Excerpt. Today, we take a look at some new developments in Lebanon. Plus, Donald Trump says he'll use the military for mass deportations. Can he? And we discuss why some Gen Z men are shifting to the right. An Israeli airstrike killed 5 people in Beirut yesterday, according to Lebanon's health ministry, marking the second day in a row Israel has hit a target within the capital as it continues its campaign against the Iran-backed armed group Hezbollah. The strike came after the group confirmed its media relations chief was killed by an Israeli strike in Beirut on Sunday. Israel has intensified its bombardment in and around Lebanon's capital in recent days, and Hezbollah has continued missile fire into Israel. But Lebanon and Hezbollah have agreed to a U.S. ceasefire proposal, a top Lebanese official told Reuters yesterday, describing the latest progress as the most serious yet to end the fighting. President-elect Donald Trump says he'll use the military for mass deportations. What would that entail, and would he be allowed to do so? I spoke with USA Today national immigration reporter Lauren Viagran for more. Hello, Lauren.
Hey, Taylor.
So, Lauren, what exactly did Donald Trump say yesterday with regards to his deportation plans?
He actually said one word with 3 exclamation points, which was truth. And he was responding to a post by a conservative activist a couple of weeks ago, basically saying that President-elect Donald Trump intended to declare a national emergency and use the military to execute on his promise to massively deport immigrants in the country illegally.
So, Lauren, is this on message for what, we've heard from him this past year on the campaign trail, some of what you and I have discussed as well? And why has he argued that such actions are needed as it pertains to deportations? And have we heard any other kind of specifics when it comes to the military side of this?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, he's been talking about this a lot on the campaign trail. But of course, it's one thing to hear from former President Trump on the campaign trail and another to hear plans outlined, even in brief, by President-elect Trump. President Trump, last time around during the first administration, also declared a national emergency related to migration. He did that at that time in order to repurpose funding for the Department of Defense and move it over to build what he was billing as a border wall, the 30-foot steel fencing at the border. This time around, it looks like he wants to declare a national emergency, again, related to migration, but to use that in order to put the military to work executing on those plans. Now, it's not exactly clear, yet what soldiers would be doing or to what extent he would attempt to federalize National Guard, which belong to the states. But, this was the next step that we've seen from him in terms of his plans.
And how are immigration experts or advocates responding to the idea of using the military in this way?
Well, to start, there is a concern that there continues to be a conflation between enforcement actions at the border and what would be required of a mass deportation, which would be interior enforcement. The U.S. military is limited in what it can do in civilian communities. It's called the Posse Comitatus Act, Taylor, and I think we're all going to be hearing a lot more about that. But that prevents the military or soldiers from, for example, arresting a civilian, even if that person is an immigrant. So, I think that there is a lot that remains to be seen about how President-elect Trump will outline his plans for the mass deportation, but we're seeing kind of the details drip out now.
All right, lots still to be decided on this. Lauren Viagran covers immigration and the border for USA Today. Thank you, Lauren.
Thanks, Taylor.
The Biden administration is asking Congress to approve nearly $100 billion in emergency funding to help it respond to a series of disasters this year. The request submitted yesterday includes $40 billion for the Federal Emergency Management Agency to provide aid in the aftermath of Hurricanes Helene and Milton, which caused catastrophic damage in the Southeast this fall. Some of the additional funding the administration is requesting would also be used to respond to other emergencies, like last year's wildfires in Maui, tornadoes across the Midwest, and the collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore. FEMA has enough money to respond to recovery efforts for Helene and Milton through the end of the year, assuming there are not any other large disasters, FEMA Administrator Dan Criswell said. But the agency is running out of money and won't have enough to get through the remainder of the fiscal year, which stretches through the end of next September without additional funding. Congress, which returned to work last week following the election, must decide whether to take up the request through standalone legislation or as part of an end-of-year spending package. President-elect Donald Trump won with Gen Z men at the polls. What's that say about our culture, masculinity, and how young men feel about the country? I rang up USA Today wellness reporter Charles Trey to discuss. Charles, thanks for making some time on this.
Thanks for having me.
So, Charles, tell us about this new kind of voter we saw this election, the Gen Z men, or as some call them, the Gen Z bros. Really, who are these folks?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think there's been a lot of discourse in the weeks leading up to the election and after about the quote unquote bro vote. I think every 4 years brings a new kind of young voter who's voting for the first time. And what's interesting about the people voting for the first time in the most recent election is they're much more online. And I think that they're less tapped into sort of traditional ways that people get their news and get their election information, which I think really had a big impact on the way that they voted this election.
So really, how did they impact things? Who did they ultimately go for?
Trump gained a lot of ground with Gen Z as a whole, and he gained a lot of ground specifically with Gen Z men. Overall, Gen Z women still went for Harris, so he gained ground with them too. But for Gen Z men, according to NBC News exit polling, about 49% went for Trump and 47% went for Harris, which is very interesting because I think it goes against sort of conventional wisdom when it comes to elections, which is that young people tend to vote for Democrats and older people tend to vote for Republicans. Obviously, that's not entirely true. There's young conservatives and older liberals, but in general, that tends to be conventional wisdom. But this election really sort of flew in the face of that. And, it's interesting because I talked to men's psychology experts to find out, well, what are young men going through right now that might push them more further to the right than in previous elections? Something that I heard was that young voters tend to favor the quote unquote rebellious candidate. And in previous generations, those candidates were seen as liberal, the countercultural candidates, the candidates sort of going against like major institutions. Now, a lot of young people perceive that candidate to be Trump. A psychologist was telling me that a lot of men feel disenfranchised right now. They're dealing with loneliness. A lot of them are struggling financially. And in general, when people feel disempowered, they also tend to support more subversive political movements. And in our current political moment, that subversive movement right now is the MAGA movement.
In terms of the Trump side of things, Charles, how did he really lean into this group on this kind of podcast media tour he went on before the election? I found this fascinating. Why were some of these media spaces maybe unique compared to more mainstream circuits? And how did that really, I guess, uniquely benefit Trump and help him cater to this group of voters?
A lot of these podcasts are extremely popular among young people and Gen Z specifically, but I think for a lot of people over 30, they've never heard of them before. The Full Send podcast with the Nelk Boys, this past weekend with Theo Vaughn, 6 Feet Under with Mark Calloway. And these podcasts specifically appeal directly to young men. They're very off the cuff. They're very informal. It's a lot of joking. It's a lot of sort of like bro talk, that kind of thing. And I think Trump knew specifically that, according to one of his campaign advisors that I spoke with, basically a lot of these voters are tuned out of legacy media. They don't watch CNN. They don't watch Fox. They don't watch MSNBC. They don't really read major newspapers, but they do tap into culture through these podcasts. And I think Trump knew that if he could just get on these podcasts, he could speak to them directly in a way that no other politician currently was. And according to men's psychologists, this matters a lot to young men because a lot of them feel like, as a group, whether or not it's justified or not, they do feel as if their issues aren't being talked about in mainstream media. So to have a candidate go on the podcast that they like, that they listen to and speak directly to them, made them feel seen in a way that they haven't by other politicians. And I think that really helped clinch him the vote for that demographic.
All right, this was a terrific piece. I implore the listeners to go check out the full version with a link in today's show notes. Charles Trey covers wellness for USA Today. Thank you, Charles.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to The Excerpt. You can get the podcast wherever you get your pods, and if you're on a smart speaker, just ask for The Excerpt. I'm Taylor Wilson, and I'll be back tomorrow with more of The Excerpt from USA Today.